So here's part 2, and we're starting from slide 26. I just inserted some additional material, so by the time you're listening to this, I should have the new version up. If you go to slide 27, you'll see it says review from last week, Qing priorities. So you've already seen this slide, but I just want to remind you of the context, and that is that the Qing dynasty wanted to stop Tibet from falling under foreign influence, yet the British were interested in exerting some foreign influence. Over the course of the centuries, the Chinese had maintained peace in Tibet by their own view anyway, by confining authority to rulers who would be loyal and compliant with orders from Peking. And they worked to gradually reduce Tibetan territory as much as possible. You can see that in this map here, and we'll see some other maps that depict the expanding and declining territory of Tibet. And then go on to slide 27, also a review from last week about the British invasion of Tibet in 1903 to 04. And an important point about this is that local Indian government rulers, who were, of course, from London, wanted to expand a bit quicker into Tibet than did their superiors in London. And the reason for that is that the British who were in charge of India were focused on the needs of their administration in India. They were not focused on the wider needs of the British Empire, which included maintaining decent relations with the Qing and subsequent Chinese governments in order to guarantee access for trade. A recurring theme. Let's go on then to slide 29 and talk a bit about the forces at work in Tibet at the end of the Qing dynasty. The Qing court, by this time, the last few years of the dynasty, knew that they could not trust the Dalai Lama. This is the 13th Dalai Lama we're speaking about, to keep Tibet in the Qing Empire and to do as he was told, because Qing power was on the wane. And I've put a couple quotes in from the Dalai Lama's letters, first to the British and to the Qing court. To the British, he begged them to intervene and kick out the Chinese. To the Qing, he asked them to please withdraw your troops from Kham, which is in the east there. You can see Kham on the map. The people of Kham, you'll see them in other readings, I think, are the Khampas, Khampas, the Khampas, who were sought after by the CIA and the Taiwanese, or the Chinese nationalists, to foment uprisings in eastern Tibet. The CIA actually trained Khampas in different places, including Colorado, to form guerrilla groups. Anyway, we'll get to that later on. The Qing, in the last, they were still a virulent force, even in the last year of the dynasty. A reality about that situation is that, in spite of the fact that they fell in 1911 because so many local leaders could see that the empire was spinning apart, until that moment came, the Qing's power was quite strong all over the empire, except in the face of occasional local uprisings. And it was a surprise to most observers that the Qing fell as quickly and as easily as they did. Anyway, they were strong enough to invade Tibet in 1910, causing the Dalai Lama to scurry over the border to India, to Kalimpong in particular, which was then and is now a Tibetan community. However, then came the fall of the Qing Empire only a year later, and this created a power vacuum. Let's go on to slide 30. Eventually, in about early 1912, all the Qing forces were out of Tibet, what were now the former Qing forces, because it was no longer to the government that followed, the Yuan Shikai government. It was no longer such a priority to commit troops to keep Tibet in line, and so they tried to keep Tibet in the empire by negotiation with the British. However, at this point, it was the British who held the balance of power, who were the most powerful party in the equation. The British wanted a harmless buffer zone to protect India. They wanted room to develop commercial interests there, and also they wanted to make sure that they were not shooting themselves in the foot by pissing off the Chinese to the extent that the more lucrative trade in Greater China, or the Chinese mainland, was affected. The Tibetans, of course, wanted to get rid of the Chinese and wanted British guarantees of protection, leading, if possible, to an independent Tibet. And China didn't want any of this, of course. They wanted the British to get out, and they wanted agreement that Tibet was a part of China. And so they entered into, the British forced them really, to enter into this conference at Simla in India in 1913. And it went on for over 6 months into 1914. However, it didn't come out very well for anybody. Nobody got exactly what they wanted except the British. If we go on to slide 31, you can see these interesting series of maps about who wanted what. The Tibetans claimed a great deal of territory, and this, in essence, was what some scholars call ethnographic Tibet nowadays. That is the part of the world that is or was at that time mostly populated by Tibetan people. This also represented the height of control of the Tibetans at various parts of history. For the most part, it represents the height of their control in the region. However, the Qing government wanted something much different, and the nationalist government, you can see how they depicted, in the bottom left there, how they depicted Tibetan territory. They wanted the smallest possible Tibet, partly in order to ensure their own security. The British pushed for an inner Tibet and outer Tibet idea. Inner Tibet would be the part closest to China. Outer Tibet would be what is today the Tibetan Autonomous Region, the center of Tibetan culture, U and Tsang, the area around Lhasa and Shigatse, hoping that the Chinese would buy into the same idea that they had bought into with Mongolia, calling Outer Mongolia that which is now the Mongolian People's Republic, and Inner Mongolia the ethnic Mongolian areas that are inside the People's Republic of China today. But they didn't. They were smart enough to not go down that road. And the Chinese also refused, just as they did in Versailles several years later, 5 years later. The deal offered was so bad that they refused to sign. So in a secret agreement, the British and Tibetans exchanged notes promising to adhere to the unsigned Simla Convention. The British Foreign Office decided not to enter into a formal treaty with Tibet because, again, in spite of how weak China was, they wanted to preserve future trade relations. Commercial considerations were very high on London's agenda. They did not want to piss off the Chinese and cause them to negatively affect trade with Britain. The Tibetans were allowed to retain their own army, currency, post office, customs control, which, considering other areas of the world that were controlled or heavily influenced by the British, was relatively generous. But there was a reason for this. It had nothing to do with any fascination with Tibet or any respect for the Tibetan people. It was entirely pragmatic. Tibet, again, as we've discussed previously, is a very difficult place to go to, except by air. Tibet is very difficult to invade from India. It's a little bit less difficult to invade from China. And the traditional way to invade Tibet is to come in from the east through Kham and Amdo, which is now parts of Sichuan province where Chengdu and Chongqing is. Chongqing, again, the largest city in present-day China, at over 20 million people. You go west from there, from Chengdu in particular, and if you're flying, within about 45 minutes, you're over Tibet. If you're traveling by road, you can get there in about a day and a half. And so this has always been the traditional way of invading Tibet, is to go through Kham and Amdo, which is in the north and is present-day Qinghai, Qinghai province, known for its prisons. The Japanese invasion in 1937 temporarily preserved Tibet's independence. Nobody cared in the chaos of World War II to try to make a big deal out of Tibet, but that was, of course, a temporary situation. The man who you saw in the previous slide, sitting in the middle of that group, Sir Henry McMahon, is known today as the creator of the McMahon Line. If you go to slide 32, you can see this area that's in the far eastern corner, northeastern corner of India, next to Burma, and just above Bangladesh, which is disputed territory even today. The McMahon Line is the northern frontier in that red-colored area that you see, and it's known as the McMahon Line because Henry McMahon decided that surveys had been done for the border between Tibet and India would include this particular region. This was a big deal to subsequent Chinese governments, and indeed it was one of the primary causes of the 1962 war between China and India, which we will get to later. So that brings us up to date with what was going on in one of China's most contentious border regions. Let's go on now to talk about the nationalist decade and the start of the Chinese Communist Revolution. Skip to line or slide 34. So as the nationalists were busy with an underground war in Shanghai against the Chinese communists, whose leadership were ensconced in the foreign enclaves, in Shanghai that were not yet, in 1928-29, not yet too dangerous for them to live in. Out in the sticks in Jiangxi province, which is in south central China. Jiangxi is an inland province. It is to the west of Fujian and to the northwest of Guangdong. Jiangxi province, a very hard place with lots of mountains, with less agricultural land than most other parts of East China, is where the Communist Party's military gathered and took refuge in the mountains in this very difficult region. The principal military leaders were Zhu De and Mao Zedong, who brought their forces together in a place in Jiangxi called Jinggangshan. And they were the sole military resource of the Chinese Communist Party, and also were the recipient of most of the Comintern's funds that they sent to China. This is Russian money from Moscow that came in and funded, partly funded the operations of the Central Committee in Shanghai and some other underground operations in other urban areas in China. But the vast majority of the money went to build up the armies of Zhumao, as they were called by some people in China, that is, by peasants. Edgar Snow, who wrote the landmark work Red Star over China, when he first started hearing about the communists, the people he spoke with simply referred to them as Zhumao, not knowing that this was two people, Zhu De and Mao Zedong. They were isolated from the Central Committee leadership, although technically subordinate to it, and this meant that they were pretty much on their own and were able to develop independently in some ways from the Central Committee. And as things got worse and worse in the cities, as we saw in the last lecture, it became the refuge. And as 1930 and 31 came about, gradually people from Shanghai and the Central Committee transferred from Shanghai to Jiangxi and came in and were the political bosses. And this presented a small problem for Mao Zedong. Zhu De was always one of Mao Zedong's men. He always considered himself subordinate to Mao once they got together in Jinggangshan. He considered Mao Zedong to be the individual with the best strategic mind and the most political acumen. Zhu De was a fantastic soldier, but not any sort of politician. And so Mao Zedong began to politically struggle as things went on, as these people arrived from Shanghai. And we'll get back to that in a little bit. Let's take a quick look now at slide 35 and talk about one instance that illustrates the way the Comintern worked in China. These two people here, the so-called Nulens couple, were arrested by the nationalists after some signal intelligence told them that who was who and what they were doing. The Nulens couple were responsible for bringing in the funding from Moscow and distributing it not only in China but to communist movements throughout the region. And Hilaire Nulens, as he was known, had numerous other identities. He was actually a Ukrainian. The NKVD was the predecessor of the KGB. It was the Soviet secret police and foreign intelligence service. He was actually a Ukrainian NKVD agent named Jacob Rudnik, and his spouse was a Soviet diplomat. before they were posted to Shanghai without diplomatic cover. That is, they were illegals. And so they operated with foreign passports that were not Russian, with third country passports, and pursued Moscow's program of funding and training local communists and passing funds on to communist movements also in Southeast Asia. They were arrested and they became the subject of a big international campaign to win their release, which was led by none other than Song Cheng-ling, Madame Sun Yat-sen, who you might recall was the her first espionage-related role was when she was married to Sun Yat-sen. She became his decoder. She would encipher and decipher telegrams to and from Sun Yat-sen, her first taste of the secret world. And she eventually took on a major role as in the CCP underground, and also even recruited agents, including an American named Sidney Rittenberg, who we will discuss next week, I think. We'll stop this recording here and continue with slide 36.